right, welcome everybody. This is Mind, Technology, and Society. If you're here as a grad student, please sign in. If you're here as an undergrad and you're in my class, you can also sign in the same thing. There's a clipboard going around the room. Professor Carlos Montemayor is here from San Francisco State University, and he'll be talking to us today about attention and consciousness.
Well, thank you all for coming, and thank you, Caroline, for the invitation. It's very nice to be here. So yeah, I'll be talking about sort of a general framework for understanding the relationship between what philosophers call phenomenal consciousness, that's the experience, the subjective experience of pain, or for example, taste, associated with the senses, and attention, which is a much more robustly studied topic in psychology, much more well understood than consciousness, very well researched in, for example, across species. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about that. So I'm going to talk about this dissociation, or this distinction between consciousness and attention in different domains. I'll talk about the evolutionary aspects or evolutionary arguments one can provide for the difference between consciousness and attention. And then I will say a few things about how that informs topics in philosophy, in the perception of time, memory, language, and even the distinction between the different senses. So there's here's like the sketch of an argument of this work that I'm doing now. Basically what it means is, well, I'll go through the argument and explain it. So there's a debate about what is the status of subjectivity and subjective experience when it comes to our knowledge of the world. That is what I'm calling epistemic status. Okay, so the epistemic status of consciousness, you can think of it as whether or not consciousness is our window to the world. It's what gives knowledge of any kind to the world, or whether it's something else. So what I'll be arguing for is that it is attention that is the sort of like the epistemic entry point to the world, or to a set of facts, and that phenomenal consciousness plays a different role. So of course they can overlap, they can happen in the human mind, they co-occur simultaneously, where during waking life and during dreams we have access to content, but what I'll argue is that it is the way attention works that gives us knowledge. Okay, and then one of the questions is going to be, what is the role of consciousness? So the argument goes roughly as follows: the epistemic status of consciousness depends on publicly available ways of specifying the contents of phenomenally conscious states, and by content, really, you can work with information theoretic notions or even computer science notions of the sort of like accuracy conditions that you require for certain interpretations of algorithms or just inferences. So content really here, I mean, the more sophisticated kind of content is semantic content, and of course some philosophers deny that machines could have that. So the notion of content here is the semantic notion. Then phenomenal consciousness cannot have epistemic status without at least joint attention, right? So it may be that actually it's much more complicated what we need to have this publicly available content that gives phenomenal consciousness or subjectivity its epistemic status, because we definitely think phenomenal consciousness has epistemic status. We think our access to shape and color is our subjective experience of color and shape. But it is an open question, how does that satisfy, how that subjective character satisfy the requirements of the publicity of content? Okay, so one of the arguments here is that we are going to need at least joint attention, maybe not language, but joint attention. Definitely language is going to be sufficient for this, but maybe not necessary, and certainly not for phenomenality. So then, phenomenal consciousness, because it's very important and we experience it daily, and it's the first thing, this is the type of thing that philosophers say. It is the first thing we quickly realize after we open our eyes that we're aware of the world. So clearly it's playing a role. So what role is it playing if it's not going to be entirely epistemic? So that's one question that I want to address. And one proposal is that it plays some I mean, this is a bit open-ended, but some really primitive, important moral or aesthetic component in our lives. And then a question is going to be, what exactly is that? Okay. So about language, obviously language is a huge topic in psychology. I'm not going to address here many of the very difficult aspects of language. But one thing that is well known about language is that it's a bunch of abilities that are related to attention. So not only when it comes to syntax processing, that is kind of largely unconscious, but also with respect to semantic content. Language can be understood in terms of these attention skills. And of course, one aspect of language that is universally recognized is that it's constrained by a publicity sort of requirement. What I'm calling the contents are out in the open. That's how we can coordinate action and actually structure what philosophers call the truth conditions for propositions, or the accuracy conditions for linguistic representation. So one view is that consciousness is the way we're acquainted with phenomenal contents or with our conscious awareness is what allows us to satisfy this publicity requirement. But of course, there's an immediate problem here, which is that that's hard to square with the deeply subjective and first-person point of view aspect of consciousness. So another alternative is that phenomenal consciousness provides the type of information structure or informational structure that we can exploit through these joint attention routines. But it is really going to be the attention routines and the way they specify content that is going to provide consciousness with content or with epistemic status. And so the general puzzle here is, what is the role of language in framing consciousness? And many people think that because consciousness is the kind of primitive state you can be in by just having pain, that the role of language cannot be sort of fundamental. But of course it's going to play some role, and the question is, if you want to think of consciousness as structured by content, like propositional content, it's going to be hard to just appeal to the subjective experience of consciousness. You will also need to appeal to how that content is interpreted, and that seems to be constrained by what I'm calling this publicity requirement. That we need to coordinate what we're talking about when we talk about color, even subjective experience. Okay, so this is just to give some, because you would think that philosophers have always assumed that it is obvious that our access to the world is phenomenal consciousness, or our awareness of the world. But that's not the case at all. Caroline knows a lot more about this than me, but I would say that some phenomenologists actually would be skeptical about that claim. But Thomas Reith was skeptical too. So he has this case of sensorial perception without color, for example, of locations. Or sensory motor navigation without the type of specific experience that we have. And of course, you may say, well, that creature has a different type of awareness, so you're not denying that this creature is conscious. But of course, since not Thomas Nagel's paper, we know that that type of consciousness would be very alien to our own consciousness, and yet have access to the same facts. Right? So the bat phenomenology, right? What is it like to be a bat? These guys are going to have access to spatial temporal locations the way we have access to the same spatial temporal locations. Otherwise, they wouldn't be able to successfully navigate their environment. So the idea is, there is a very interesting aspect of phenomenal consciousness. It makes content very rich, but maybe it's not that it provides specific content. It's a different type of informational richness. So Reid said that about phenomenal contents, that they may not be necessary for accessing the facts and contents that we have. We could have different experiences and access the same facts. And that leaves the door open for having no experience of any type that we could describe based on our subjective experience and still have access to these facts and propositions. Okay? Interestingly, Reed says that, I mean, this is a bit ambiguous in the quote I selected, but he associates morality with the sentiments that spring from our moral faculty, he says, as naturally as the sensations of sweet and bitter. Okay? There's similar views in philosophy, but the idea is, unlike the constraints of language and content, and propositional content, which seem to necessarily depend on joint attention, the requirements of moral and aesthetic sensitivity really seem to depend fundamentally on the experiences we have, of phenomenal consciousness. Right? And then the question is how to square that with the epistemic status of consciousness. So here there are several views, and I probably shouldn't spend too much on this, except with the Mary thought experiment, but the idea is there's different options here. One of them is to say it doesn't make sense to separate our experiences from their contents. The view in philosophy that tries to articulate this very rigorously is called direct realism. The idea with direct realism is that we're acquainted with facts and aspects of the world. We don't need a complicated story about what is the status of the experiences that acquaint us with this world. But of course, again, if you're thinking of consciousness in terms of subjective awareness, that is going to be in tension with how we generalize our subjective experiences and coordinate them such that we access the same world and the same facts and the same accuracy conditions for our propositions with completely different subjective experiences, right? So that coordination problem is a problem for that version of direct realism. And of course, another problem with this is that that is not the typical version of direct realism. The typical version of direct realism is you should just believe your eyes. Right? It's not so much that you need to tell a complicated story about how we coordinate. That just seems to be a story that is not necessary. You can also solve it from the first person point of view. Okay, so then you can tell a similar story through representationism. And then, of course, you will have similar objections, like, well, the direct realist intuition seems to be capturing something essential about how we encounter properties and how they have an impact on our subjectivity. But what I'm trying to argue is that in any case, there is going to be the possibility that even if direct realism is true, there is going to be a story to be explained about this coordination business, and that could be the role of attention, while phenomenal consciousness is just going to be sort of the framework for interpretation of these attention skills. Okay? So I'm trying to suggest that this is neutral with respect to this debate between direct realist, representationist. Representationists think that all our mental life is representational in nature. There has to be accuracy conditions. The representations are satisfied by those accuracy conditions, whereas direct realists deny that. They don't think that that's a plausible story. And here, one of the, and of course there's other this is a very complicated debate, but what I'm trying to suggest is you don't need to side with one of these guys to make this point that I want to make, that the dissociation seems to actually cut across these distinctions. And the way I think you can make that very clear is by thinking about Frank Jackson's Mary case. Okay, so Mary can be described in direct realist terms. She becomes acquainted with the nature of the color red after she experiences red for the first time. Or she learns how to represent the concept phenomenal red once she encounters red for the first time. Mary is this neuroscientist who is locked in a room. She's never seen red, but she knows everything that is true about color perception. She goes out, sees red for the first time, and the question is, what is it that she learned? She learns after seeing red for the first time. The thought experiment goes by assumption. She knows everything there is to know about color. So what is going on when she experiences red? Well, you can tell that story in these two ways, or actually in many other ways, and still the question seems to be, well, whatever she learns doesn't seem to be something deeply important for epistemic purposes, okay? Because she's an expert. Actually, according to the thought experiment, she is the world expert, or something like quasi-omniscient about truths about color, right? So even if you just stick with the thought experiment, you are stuck in like a situation where it doesn't depend how you interpret it in terms of theories of perception. The thought experiment invites, and actually this is something Frank Jackson was extremely explicit in his original paper, it just doesn't seem to depend on anything that we could call, you know, knowledge of a normal kind. This is a weird thing. That's why physicalism is wrong, or something wild is going on here. Okay, so that brings the issue of what exactly is the epistemic normativity of this coordination of content, and then ultimately of joint attention and just the nature of attention in general. So the word normativity just means a domain that is governed by reasons and rules that gives you a bunch of oughts or shoulds, right? So epistemic normativity gives you norms like you should believe things that are based on good evidence, you should take good evidence into account rather than not so good evidence, you should pay attention to experts rather than to people that just don't know anything about anything. So it's a bunch of shoulds. And when it comes to language, most people that talk, I mean, this is kind of like pre the heart problem, Chalmers' heart problem, and I would say it, well, it's at the bottom there. People that talk about consciousness and the mind, like Donald Davidson, McDowell, Brandon, and I'm sure many, many other philosophers, this is just a small sample, they never thought that the epistemic status of our mental lives came from subjectivity. Most of them thought it comes from something like what Davidson called triangulation. This is a attention routine where we both coordinate our attention towards the content. McDowell very explicitly says this actually, the epistemic status of perception depends on what he calls the space of reasons. And the space of reasons is not your subjective experience. It's a very different thing. Similarly, Brandon emphasized this practice of scorekeeping, of keeping track of our inferences and our linguistic practices. Okay. None of these things appeal directly to our subjective experience. I think there's a very interesting recent case where you can actually argue that that's what's going on too with Susanna Siegel's super interesting book, The Rationality of Perception. And I think this is super interesting because if you know Susanna Siegel's work, she appeals to things like phenomenal conservatism. The view that it is by being acquainted with properties that are displayed and that we're acquainted through our conscious awareness that we gain access to propositions and through and that has deeply, that's a deep source of epistemic normativity. The reason why I say that is because she explicitly says that by introducing the normativity of inference at several layers of perception, including unconscious perception, she is expanding what McDowell called the space of reasons, or the house of reasons, or the house of reasons. Okay, so I think this is another tension, another source of tension. One of them is coordinating content seems to require stepping outside our subjective awareness. The other one is many accounts of what gives our epistemic, our life, our mental lives, epistemic status, what gives our mental lives these shoulds and shouldn't do or shouldn't accept, is something that is not really related to phenomenal consciousness. So then, of course, someone could ask, well, I don't know what you're talking about, because this doesn't really seem to square with the main worry in consciousness research, which is the heart problem. So the heart problem is not really about what is the epistemic status of consciousness. That's kind of like a weird question. The main problem is what is consciousness, or how to explain it. And Chalmers has gone, I mean, many other people, including Ned Block, have argued that consciousness is irreducible to any function, right? That you cannot give a functional account. That includes joint attention, that includes attention, forms of attention, that includes linguistic communication, that includes things that are happening in your brain, that includes a bunch of things that are not going to be explanatory of the very specific type of experience you're experiencing, for example, right now. Whatever it is, boredom or excitement, or it's that type of experience is not going to be really explained by these things that are functionally described. But what I just told you is that you need a story that is a little bit functional and a little bit dependent on attention and coordination to explain the epistemic status of the mind. So this is funny, right? So here, the proposal here is that if you take so Chalmers says that if you take the heart problem seriously, like if you're serious about the heart problem, you have to deny physicalism. Okay? That's the view that all aspects of the mind depend or supervene on physical facts. Okay? That, according to what he says, is sort of the lesson of the heart problem. But there's a different way to take the heart problem seriously. Well, that's the one that I'm suggesting here, which is, if consciousness is really, I mean, let's grant to Chalmers that he's right. Consciousness is ineffable. Consciousness is indescribable. It's subjective. It's not reducible to anything physical. Well, then it has to be epistemically ineffable, right? And of course, that's kind of like the point of Mary's thought experiment. But the interesting thing is that even though language and attention are really, really hard to explain, language is super hard to explain. But they are not ineffable in that way, right? So you cannot have an argument. I mean, people have, I think I can think of two cases, but you can't really have an argument where your premise is language exists, and then you end up with like physicalism is false, right? So one way of taking the heart problem seriously, which I think is a very interesting problem, is to think of it in terms of normativity. So it's not that what you have with the heart problem are two different aspects of the universe, consciousness and the physical world, or something like that. But you have two sources of normativity. Okay? You have epistemic normativity, which is publicly constrained, linguistically structured in our case, dependent on attention routines, especially joint attention, epistemic responsibility, epistemic accountability, social accountability, and then there's the normative role of consciousness. And the normative role of consciousness is probably different, and so the suggestion is that's probably what Mary learned, something very important for the moral and aesthetic dimensions of her mental life, and not so much something epistemically very important. So then the idea there is that when you talk about the intrinsic value of phenomenal consciousness, sort of the kind of view that people say, well, the reason why we just don't go around killing people or just like randomly killing animals, or well, let's just stick to people, is because they're something like valuable in themselves. And one way of accounting for their value is that they're aware, they're conscious living creatures. They experience pain and so on. Okay, there's a bit of an overlap here, but this is a very long argument. I don't want to go through it very carefully, but the idea is if you start thinking that this is a plausible thing to say, that these are two different sources of normativity, the phenomenal consciousness has a different role than attention, and that most of the epistemic, or all of the epistemic heavy lifting is done through attention and joint attention, then one way of understanding that in a larger framework of the mind, of understanding the mind, is through the dissociation between consciousness and attention. And here, the way I'm interpreting phenomenal consciousness, all that I've said to this point, is actually pretty controversial. But I don't think this is controversial. What I'm going to say for the rest of the talk, I don't think is controversial at all. So the first thing that is not controversial is that perceptual systems evolve. Perceptual systems in all sorts of creatures, insects, etc., evolve, and that's what drives successful communication among insects and animals, etc. And that this evolution of perceptual systems can be understood in terms of intentionality. So this might be just a way of understanding different forms of intentionality that evolve. Intentionality is the aboutness of propositions or linguistic representations, right? So, sorry? Oof.
Sorry.
I hope it comes back. Yeah, it's not coming back. Sorry. Yeah, I'll just go through what is on that slide. This is long anyway. So the idea is that the feature that Franz Brentano said was the most important feature of the mind is intentionality. So when we see that the representations are about something, so if you can explain that.
What's up, Carol?
Yeah, came back. Thank you.
It's just now it says it's about to, the battery's about to die, so I'm just trying to figure out what it can do to not do that. Okay. Oh, no. It's like very sensitive.
Maybe we move it.
Fidgety. Maybe that's what it says.
So anyway, the point of that slide is that if different types of intentionality evolve, different forms of intentionality, intentional systems, you can understand cognition in different species that way. And evolutionary psychologists can think of those functions as adaptations. But literally no one thinks that way when it comes to phenomenal consciousness. So the idea is that's one source or one justification for thinking that consciousness and attention are dissociated. And again, I don't think that's too controversial.
Sorry, I think that the wall, there's something weird with the electricity or something. But now it's powering, so I think it'll work.
Okay, yes. Yeah, maybe I'll go quickly through this thing because I'm going to try to make the same thing about I'll have a graph. I'll stop a little bit at the graph that I have. It's not really a graph; it's just an illustration. But and then there's another one about the evolution of the brain. So I mean, you can actually see that the brain evolved different areas in sort of this way, and it is very hard to, and you can understand these different areas and different neural networks in terms of attention routines. That's actually the way most people think of them, but it's very hard to think that there's a specific area that is responsible for consciousness. That's a huge debate. So even if you look at the neuroscience, there's a way of making this point. Let's see if it comes back. It should have limits.
No, it's not you. It died. The battery died. Because the wall wasn't powering it.
Oh, there it is.
Okay. Not intending to pry into your personal life here. Sorry. Okay. Cross my fingers. Probably need to be around here.
Yeah.
Oops.
That's right. Okay. So I'm going to go, I mean, this is basically the same point, but now, now thought in evolutionary terms. It's not that hard to think of basic forms of attention, navigational attention, object-based attention, even forms of object recognition as essential adaptations of most species. But it is very, very difficult to think of phenomenal consciousness that way. Famously difficult. Actually, some people think it's just hopeless to think of phenomenal consciousness as something that has any adaptive purpose. So, there's not tons of research on this, but if you read the literature on animal cognition, for example, the very famous old experiments of von Frisch on bees, the way he speaks of bee communication is almost the way we talk about language, and the way they interpret the waggle dance, and the way they pay attention to each other, and they're clearly kind of like doing something like joint attention. So it is really interesting that the basic features of attention you can find in many species, and for example, spatial navigation, selective attention, even divided attention. And so then a good question is when are these forms of attention going to really depend on phenomenal consciousness, on subjective experience? But you can easily tell a story without assuming consciousness. That's what happened for most of the history of psychology. Without consciousness, these animals are satisfying something like epistemic constraints through constraints about knowledge of their environment without directly appealing to consciousness. And you can easily document this by reading, just doing a very cursory overview of the literature on the evolution of consciousness. It's all over the place. Some people think it's in insects. Some people think you can find it in very specific areas of the brain. Some people think it's hopeless to identify specific areas of the brain. Some people even think it has nothing to do with the brain. That's Giulio Tononi's integrated information theory. It has to do with the way information is being integrated. Some people think it depends on the language capacity. And then if you add to that claim what Chomsky and Berwick say about language, then it makes it exclusively human. Right? So you go from consciousness is exclusively human to it's everywhere, basically. And there seems to be no way to tell how to constrain that in terms of what view would be more possible than another view. It's a bit more nuanced than that, but it's pretty all over the place. This is the one that I wanted to show. It's from a paper in PBR. And the idea is that some ways of defining consciousness really correlate with ways of defining attention. So access consciousness, what Netblock calls access consciousness, is literally what I was describing at the beginning. Just accessing the accuracy conditions of linguistic symbols, or accessing what symbol is about. And he distinguishes that, this is now, I don't know how standard, but quasi-standard distinction between that, sort of the intentional aspect of consciousness, and what he calls phenomenal consciousness. Actually, the title of the paper is People Are Confused About This. And of course, I'm focusing on the phenomenal, but a big question is, okay, so you look at these capacities, and let's suppose phenomenal consciousness at a capacity. The red line is something like a story you can tell in evolutionary terms. The blue line assumes a bunch of really complicated capacities, some of which might be reducible to attention, some of which might need phenomenal consciousness, but the story is not that clear. And then, of course, you have the overlap between these two different aspects of our minds. This is a brain, again, story. I'm going to try to go a little bit faster here. I have 45. Okay, so that's basically sort of what people say about, yeah, let's skip that. This is one slide where I wanted to say something about artificial intelligence, but you can think of artificial intelligence of the type that people dream of in terms of attention routines, or very specific set of attention routines. And the more human-like they become, the more they're going to be able to jointly attend with us to certain things, right? So intelligence seems to be deeply linked or deeply associated with forms of attention. And people think that there's an equal correlation with phenomenal consciousness, but actually it's not as straightforward as with attention. This is okay. So more recently, Chalmers has presented this problem called the meta problem. Okay, so the meta problem is, why do we think so? I'm just going to read this because I'm running out of time, and I definitely want to read this one before I move to the other one. So he defines the hard problem as follows. He says, explaining behavioral functions are just easy problems of consciousness. So their evolution, their cognitive function, the relation to intentionality, intelligence, structure, and dynamics. Basically everything I have described as depending on attention. Then the hard problem is why these cognitive functions must be accompanied by subjective experience. Right? And then more recently, he has presented this problem, I think it might be published now, but I'm not sure, called the meta problem, which is why do we think consciousness is hard to explain? It's kind of like a more epistemic problem. So he thinks of the hard problem in metaphysical terms. He thinks the hard problem is hard because it is a fact of the world that none of these functions is enough to explain phenomenal consciousness. He thinks of this other problem as our difficulties trying to explain the hard problem. And so what I think is interesting about this normative distinction between phenomenal consciousness and attention is that it could give you an entryway to how to solve the meta problem, not the hard problem. By the way, he says, this is interesting, he says that if you solve the meta problem, that could help a lot with the hard problem. I don't know exactly how, but so the idea is it's very hard to explain phenomenal consciousness in those terms, in those functional terms, because they are all epistemic functional aspects of our mind. And if it's true that the role of phenomenal consciousness is not to provide epistemic norms to our mental life, then that explains why we think the hard problem is really hard to explain. So maybe it's because it's not really something we can think of in terms of computation, not something we can think of the standard information processing. Maybe it has to do with our biology and the value our biology has with respect to our emotions and our reactive attitudes. Okay. Again, I'm going to skip a bunch of these, and I apologize for all the text. I don't have any nice pictures, right? I guess only one. So this dissociation, by the way, between consciousness and attention is also neutral with respect to theories of consciousness, or at least the three most prominent theories of consciousness. And the idea is, instead of having, as Chalmers thought, 2 dimensions of content, right? So 1 dimension, 2 dimensions of semantic content, one epistemically constrained and another one wise, what he calls external. You have 2 sources of normativity, right? And content is understood the way people understood content before this interpretation of 2-dimensional semantics. And an advantage is that you can have an understanding of consciousness, or the beginnings of an understanding of consciousness, in terms of our reactive attitudes, both towards morality and towards aesthetic value. And you don't have to fall, you can deny that the main role of phenomenal consciousness is epistemic, but you don't need to become an epiphenomenalist, or someone who says it just has no purpose. Consciousness is just this weird thing we have. It's a form of illusion. Okay. That's another argument that has to do with language as a constraint on all epistemic capacities, and we'll skip it, because I think I said a few things about it. So I think it's better if I finish, because I have like 2 minutes, right? 3. If I finish with like concrete applications or concrete ways of thinking of this dissociation in very surprising contexts. So in the context of time perception, this is the topic that I've worked for the most part of my early career. If you read the literature on time perception, it's very, I mean, it's just evident that animals keep track of time in super complex ways. And that none of these things really depend on sort of like some type of awareness. They're mechanically dependent on systems that they have to work like mechanical clocks. And you have to show that these clocks are reliable, that they are sort of going to provide the animal with information that the animal can trust. And you can provide a really mechanical explanation of this. That's how the literature operated, and we have them. But what is interesting is that if you look at the literature on time awareness, and which is very deeply influenced by the phenomenologists, what they say is this cannot be reduced to the mechanisms of clocks, this cannot be reduced to the mechanisms of navigation, it is non-metric, some people say. The distinctions between simultaneity, succession, before and after, get blurred in our conscious awareness of time. We don't live in a sort of sequentially framed mental framework. We live in this unified bubble of awareness in time and space. So the phenomenologists have contributed greatly to the difference between conscious awareness of time and time perception. And here is one area where you can actually see that a lot of what animals are mechanically doing or reliably doing depends on literally paying attention to features of the environment and how they are keeping track of them, temporal features of the environment, in terms of their timing mechanisms. This is a super interesting, complicated literature. Every sense has its own internal way of timing events. Auditory clocks or auditory time framing differs from visual time perception. So there's a question of how does this happen cross-modally. But even though it's a very complicated coordination problem, you can still draw the line between your phenomenal conscious awareness of time and how each aspect of your sort of mechanical time clicking mechanisms do it. So here you have, again, I think a demonstration of the dissociation between consciousness and attention. I'm working on memory now. And in memory, there's a debate. I mean, I don't want to bore you with the debate, but the main point is that the memory system doesn't work like a computer. Although it does if you just look at episodic memory and its requirements. It turns out that people say, no, actually episodic memory is highly contextual. It doesn't work like a storage mechanism. And then the question is, okay, so what is it that updates the contextualization of these memory traces? And it turns out to be something related to what is vivid and emotionally relevant to us. So in the memory system, you can identify sort of more implicit attention-dependent aspects of memory, especially with respect to procedural memory. And what I'm working on now, something I've published recently, is that autobiographical memory, which depends on our reactive attitudes, is really deeply related to conscious awareness, and it doesn't play an exclusively epistemic function. So I'm trying to make the same point that I apply to time perception to memory. I'm not, this is the last, yeah? Okay, so, a future project, I haven't done much about this, is how to distinguish the senses in terms of this dissociation. So I have the hunch that some senses, like vision, are a lot more epistemically driven than others. The idea is vision is extremely rich epistemically, and we can interpret what we're seeing in many ways. And it's fast, and we can update information very quickly, and the speed of light is the fastest speed, or at least it's super fast. But then other senses seem to provide a more homeostatic or somatory sensory platform for emotions and for reactions that have to do with morality and aesthetics. And they seem to also be fundamental for how the unit of consciousness is integrated. Right? So it doesn't seem like taste or smell really are like super crucial in the human case, and this might be species dependent. For accessing contents, although of course we can do that, it's just that we don't rely on them as much as we rely on vision and audition. And it might be that the other senses that are more connected to homeostasis and the limbic system are more related to the way awareness is integrated than these other senses. Although, of course, I'm not denying that we're aware of conscious vision. It's just that if you think about what makes the senses different, this is one way of thinking about this. That's it, thank you.